A man dressed like that couldn't possibly own $5 million.
Marissa Keene didn't just say it. She tore the check in half right in front of Wesley Carver's 9-year-old daughter. No phone call to verify. No review of the account history. Just one look at his worn jacket and older car, and she'd already decided. What she didn't know Wesley was the founder of Carver Ridge Partners, the firm holding a $620 million contract with her bank. He had the power to end it all with one phone call. And she'd just humiliated him in front of his child. When the bank's regional president walked through that door and called him Sir, Marissa's career and everything she thought she knew began to collapse. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's a good time. Stories like this one come out every week, and you won't want to miss what happens next. The morning Wesley Carver pulled into the Meridian Trust Bank parking lot. He was thinking about dinner reservations, not about the kind of day that changes a person's life. Tessa sat in the passenger seat, her backpack balanced on her knees, telling him about a book she wanted to find at Henderson's, the little bookstore 2 blocks from her school, that smelled like old paper and cinnamon. Wesley listened, nodded, tapped his thumb against the steering wheel. After the bank, he told her. 15 minutes, maybe 20, and they'd be back on the road. He cut the engine and glanced at the envelope on the dashboard. Inside was a check for $5 million proceeds from shares he'd held in a clean energy startup since its earliest days back when no one believed in it. He'd already decided what to do with the money. Before the check had even cleared half into a trust for Tessa's education, the other half into a fund he'd been planning for over a year, one that would offer scholarships and childcare support to single-parent families. It wasn't a complicated transaction. He'd had an account at this branch for over 12 years. Tessa climbed out of the car and fell in beside him as they crossed the lot. She noticed the car immediately, a silver sedan parked at an angle near the entrance, newer than anything else in the row. "How come we never get a car like that?" she asked. Wesley told her that a car got you where you needed to go, and where they needed to go was inside. She accepted that the way she accepted most of what he said, without argument, but with the quiet skepticism of a child who was paying close attention. Inside the branch was cool and unhurried. 3 tellers were behind the counter, and a small seating area near the window held 2 men in blazers reviewing something on a tablet. One of the tellers glanced up when Wesley and Tessa walked in, then glanced back down. A man in a tailored coat who had arrived several minutes after them was called up to a window almost immediately. Wesley noticed. Tessa noticed too. She leaned close and whispered, "How come nobody called us yet?" Wesley told her he didn't know, but that they shouldn't jump to conclusions about why maybe the other customer had an appointment. Maybe there was something they weren't seeing. Tessa looked at him with an expression that said she didn't entirely believe that, but she let it go. When a window finally opened for them, the teller who waved them over was a young woman named Jenna Boyd. She had a calm, professional manner, and she greeted Wesley without any particular warmth or coldness, just the steady neutrality of someone doing a job she knew well. Wesley slid the envelope across the counter and explained that he wanted to deposit the check into his existing account. He gave her the account number from memory. Jenna opened the envelope, looked at the check, and went very still for just a moment. $5 million had a way of doing that. She told him she'd need to call a manager over to authorize the transaction. Wesley said that was fine. He'd expected it. What he hadn't expected was Marissa Keene. She came out of the back office wearing a blazer that still had the faint crease of something recently purchased, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had just been promoted and hadn't yet been tested. She was the branch manager had been for less than 4 weeks, as Wesley would later learn. She took the check from Jenna, looked at the amount, and then looked at Wesley. Not at his face exactly. At his jacket, the old canvas field jacket his wife had given him the winter before she got sick, the one he still wore because getting rid of it had never felt like something he was ready to do. At his shoes. At the 10-year-old car visible through the window behind him. "Sir," she said, and the word had an edge to it, "I'm going to need to ask you a few questions before we can proceed." Wesley said, "Of course." What followed wasn't a verification process. It was an interrogation conducted in the middle of the lobby, within earshot of every other customer in the branch. Marissa wanted to know where the money came from. She wanted to know why he didn't have a financial advisor present. She wanted to know why he'd brought a child to conduct a transaction of this size, as though Tessa's presence were itself a form of evidence. She asked why a man with $5 million would drive the car she'd seen in the parking lot. Each question was framed politely, but the framing didn't soften the implication beneath it. She had already decided who he was, and she was building a case. Wesley answered everything. He laid out his driver's license, his account card, the sale documentation from the brokerage, the confirmation letter from the transfer company, and the contact information for both his attorney and his CFO. He told Marissa she was welcome to call the issuing bank directly. Jenna, who had been quiet, offered to make that call herself. Marissa told Jenna to return to her station. A few of the other customers had started watching. One of them had his phone out. Another couple near the seating area had turned their chairs slightly, the way people do when they want to watch something, without admitting they're watching. A man standing near the far wall said something low to the woman beside him, something Wesley didn't catch, but Tessa did. The man had said that Wesley was probably using the little girl to make himself look more trustworthy, that it was a common technique. Nobody disagreed with him. Tessa's hand found Wesley's and held it. He asked Marissa calmly to move the conversation to a private office and to begin the standard verification steps. He told her he had been a customer at this branch for over 12 years and that his account history was available on her screen if she chose to look at it. He was not raising his voice. He was not making demands. He was offering her every possible route to a resolution that didn't involve humiliating a man in front of his daughter. Marissa seemed to take his composure as an insult. She told him that in her professional judgment, the check was fraudulent. She said it without reviewing the documents he had provided. She said it without making a single call. And then she reached across the counter, picked up the check, and tore it in half. Tessa flinched at the sound. Marissa kept tearing. She split each half again, then again, letting the pieces fall to the counter and drift down to the floor like something that had never mattered. Then she looked at Wesley and said, "A person who legitimately owns $5 million does not walk into this branch looking the way you do." Tessa bent down to pick up the pieces. Wesley touched her shoulder gently and shook his head. He didn't want her on her knees on the floor of this bank, gathering scraps that had been used to humiliate her father. Tessa straightened up, still holding his hand. Wesley looked at Marissa steadily. "You just turned a routine verification into the most expensive mistake of your career." She heard it as a threat. Within 60 seconds, she had dialed the non-emergency police line and reported that a man was attempting to pass a fraudulent financial instrument, that he had become threatening toward staff, and that he was refusing to leave the premises. She then turned to Curtis Lane, the security guard stationed near the entrance, and told him to escort the man out. Curtis was a large, quiet man who had worked at this branch for almost 3 years. He had been standing near enough to hear everything, every question Marissa had asked. Every answer Wesley had given, every offer Wesley had made to resolve the situation through proper channels. He had watched Jenna try to intervene and get silenced. He had watched Tessa flinch when the check was torn. He knew with the kind of certainty that didn't require analysis that something wrong was happening. He also knew that Marissa was his supervisor, that he had a mortgage, and that the branch had already gone through 1 round of staff cuts that year. He crossed the lobby and placed a hand on Wesley's shoulder. Wesley stood very still. He understood the position he was in. If he resisted even passively, it would be recorded on someone's phone and stripped of context. If he raised his voice, the narrative would become about his behavior, not Marissa's. He had watched enough situations like this, had heard enough from clients, from colleagues, from people whose stories never made it onto anyone's screen to know exactly how it could go wrong. So he kept his hands visible and his voice low, and he did not pull away from Curtis. But when Marissa told one of the junior staff members to hold Tessa back so Curtis could take Wesley out separately, the steadiness he'd been holding on to shifted. He drew Tessa in against his side and told the room without shouting that no one was going to touch his daughter. Marissa said, "That kind of behavior is exactly why I called." Wesley understood that anything he did from this point forward could be used against him. He also understood that there was no version of this situation in which he walked out that door without his daughter beside him. He spoke quietly to Curtis, who was still standing at his shoulder. He said he wasn't going to make this difficult, but he wasn't going to leave Tessa in that lobby without him. Curtis, to his credit, said nothing. He kept his hand where it was, but didn't push. The lobby had gone almost completely quiet. Every phone was up. A woman near the window had stopped pretending to look at her paperwork. A man by the door had taken a small step forward and then stopped as if he'd thought about saying something and decided against it. Jenna stood at her window with her hands flat on the counter, watching everything not moving. Tessa looked around at all of it, the phones, the silence, the careful way everyone was watching without acting, and said in a voice that was smaller than usual but entirely clear, "Why is everybody just filming? Why won't anyone say that my dad didn't do anything wrong?" Nobody answered her. Some people looked down. One woman lowered her phone slightly, then raised it again. The man who had taken that small step toward the center of the room took a step back. The lobby held its silence like something it was ashamed of. Wesley heard his daughter's question land in the room and find nothing to hold on to. He thought about what he'd told her that morning in the parking lot, that you shouldn't jump to conclusions about why things happen, that there might be things you weren't seeing. He wondered if she was revising her opinion of that advice right now. He wondered if she had a right to. The fight in front of him was no longer just about a check. Marissa had already destroyed the check. The fight now was something else, about whether the truth would arrive in time to matter, and about what Tessa would carry out of this building, regardless of how it ended. A child could survive watching her father be wronged. What was harder to survive was watching the people around them decide one by one that it wasn't their problem. Wesley had faced difficult rooms before. He had sat across from investors who'd written him off. At first glance had built something real out of situations where no one expected him to succeed. He knew how to wait. He knew how to hold a position without making it worse. But he had never had to do it with his daughter's hand in his, in a bank that held 12 years of his account history on a screen that no one had bothered to check. He kept his hands visible. He kept his voice steady. He told Curtis quietly that he would cooperate with whatever process the bank needed to follow, but that he was not leaving without Tessa, and he was not leaving in silence. If the police were coming, he would wait for them here in this lobby, where there were cameras and witnesses, and a floor covered in the pieces of a document that had been destroyed without a single verification call being made. Curtis looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor, at the torn paper scattered across the tile. He didn't move Wesley toward the door. Marissa was already on another call. The police were 10, maybe 15 minutes away. The phones were still recording. And Wesley Carver stood in the middle of it all, holding his daughter's hand, waiting for the truth to find its way into the room before the situation found its way past the point of no return. Curtis began moving them toward the door, not roughly, but with the steady, practiced pressure of someone who had decided to finish what he'd started. His hand remained on Wesley's shoulder, and the distance between them and the exit was shrinking. Tessa kept pace with her father, her fingers locked around his, her eyes moving between Curtis and the glass door ahead, as though she was calculating something she didn't have the vocabulary to name yet. The lobby had settled into a strange kind of performance. People who had been pretending to look at their phones were no longer pretending they held them openly pointed at the two figures being walked toward the exit. A woman near the teller windows had stepped back slightly to get a better angle. The man who had suggested earlier that Wesley was using Tessa as a prop stood with his arms crossed, watching with the satisfied expression of someone who had called it correctly. Marissa addressed the room without directing her words at anyone in particular. She spoke about the bank's obligation to protect its customers from fraudulent activity, about the procedures she was legally required to follow, about how difficult it was to make these calls but how necessary. Her tone was managerial, controlled the tone of a person building a record. Jenna Boyd had not returned to her station. She stood at the edge of the teller area and said clearly enough for anyone nearby to hear that the check had not been verified as fraudulent. She said that Wesley had provided every document the process required, that his account had been open for over 12 years, and that a single phone call to the issuing bank, a call that could be made right now from this desk, would resolve the entire situation. She wasn't raising her voice, but she wasn't softening it either. Marissa turned to look at her with an expression that didn't need words. Then she provided them anyway. If Jenna said one more thing, she would be dismissed before the end of the business day. The words were delivered quietly, the way serious warnings usually are. Jenna closed her mouth. She moved back toward her station, but she didn't sit down, and before she did anything else, she reached beneath the counter and confirmed with 2 keystrokes that the camera system covering the main floor was recording, and that the footage was being backed up off-site in real time. It was a routine check she performed every shift. Nobody watched her do it. The space between Wesley and the door had become very small. Curtis was still guiding him forward, and Wesley was still not resisting. He had made his calculation, and he was holding to it, even as the exit came into view, and the cool morning light pressed through the glass. Tessa looked up at Curtis and asked him in a voice that was entirely without hostility if he actually thought her father had done something wrong. Curtis didn't answer. That was when the door opened from the outside. The man who walked in was somewhere in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm, and moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never needed to rush to get attention in a room. He took 3 steps inside and stopped. His eyes moved across the lobby, across Curtis and Wesley, across Tessa with her hand tight in her father's, across the pieces of the torn check still visible on the floor, near the far counter, across the phones, raised in a dozen hands, and finally across Marissa standing behind the teller line with her arms at her sides. Conrad Ellis dropped the portfolio. He didn't bend to pick it up. He crossed the lobby in a straight line, and when he reached Wesley, he looked at him the way a person looks at someone they genuinely know, not a customer, not a case number, and said, "Mr. Carver, sir, what happened here?" The word moved through the room like a current. Curtis lifted his hand from Wesley's shoulder and took a step back. It wasn't a dramatic gesture. It was the quiet, immediate response of someone who had just recalculated everything. The lobby, which had been holding its breath around the performance of one certainty, shifted into the performance of another. People with phones still had them raised, but the angle had changed. Marissa recovered quickly. She introduced herself by title and began explaining that she had just prevented a significant fraud attempt, that a man had presented a $5 million check of questionable origin, had refused to comply with standard verification requests, and had become verbally threatening toward her staff. She delivered this with the same controlled confidence she'd used on the room moments earlier. She did not appear to register yet exactly who Conrad Ellis was or what his presence meant. Conrad listened to her finish. Then he asked in a tone that was entirely without sharpness which verification steps she had completed before concluding the check was fraudulent. Marissa began with the visual inspection. Conrad waited. She did not continue. He turned back to Wesley and addressed him directly, which had the effect of excluding Marissa from the conversation entirely without requiring any effort. He told the room what Wesley had not said himself, that Wesley Carver was the founder of Carver Ridge Partners, that the firm was one of Meridian Trust Bank's largest institutional clients, that the $5 million check was fully legitimate and traceable to a brokerage transaction. The bank had already received documentation on that morning. He also said that Wesley was the person whose signature stood between the bank and a $620 million contract that was currently in its final stage of review. Then Conrad crouched down to Tessa's eye level and told her that he was sorry. Not with the practiced sorry of a liability statement, but with the plain sorry of a man looking at a child who had been frightened in a place where she should have been safe, and knowing that the place was his responsibility. Tessa looked at him for a moment, and then looked at her father. Wesley was watching Marissa. She was watching the room rearrange itself around a new understanding of who he was, and something in her face moved through several positions before it settled. She said that Wesley should have identified himself when he came in. She said that a person conducting a transaction of this size had a responsibility to present themselves in a way that matched the transaction. She said that she couldn't be expected to make accurate judgments without accurate information, and that if Wesley had been more transparent about who he was, none of this would have happened. Wesley asked her one question, whether a customer needed to prove they were wealthy before they were entitled to basic courtesy. She didn't answer that. She shifted back to procedure, to risk management, to the bank's legal obligations, the language of an institution protecting itself dressed up as policy. Conrad pointed to the floor. He asked her to identify the policy that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal financial instrument in front of that customer's child without completing a single verification step. He asked her to find that in any document the bank had issued at any level of its operation. She couldn't find it because it didn't exist. Conrad asked for her employee badge, her keys, and for her to step away from the computer terminal while the branch's compliance officer was contacted. His voice had not risen once during the entire exchange. Marissa looked at him for a long moment, then set her badge on the counter. What happened next took less than 4 minutes. While Conrad walked Wesley and Tessa to the seating area near the window, and while Curtis stood near the entrance looking at the floor with the expression of a man reviewing every decision he'd made in the past 20 minutes, Marissa moved back toward her terminal. She did it without drawing attention to herself, casually, the way someone moves when they're pretending to retrieve something they forgot. She sat down and began typing. Jenna saw it. She crossed the floor in 6 steps, placed her hand flat on the keyboard, and told Marissa that whatever she was doing needed to stop. She said it quietly, directly, without looking away. Marissa told her she was updating a record. Jenna told her she knew what record it was, that she had already read the notes Marissa had added to Wesley's account. Notes describing him as a high-risk fraud suspect, as aggressive as a potential threat to staff safety, and that the camera above them had been recording for the past hour and a half to an off-site server. Marissa took her hand off the keyboard. Jenna walked to where Conrad was standing and told him what she had seen. Conrad said 3 words to Marissa that ended her employment at Meridian Trust Bank before the morning was over. The police arrived 11 minutes after Marissa had called them. 2 officers came through the door to find a lobby that looked nothing like what had been described. A man sitting calmly in the seating area with his daughter. A terminated employee being interviewed by the bank's regional president, and approximately 15 customers who had filmed the entire sequence of events and were in several cases already offering their contact information to the officer near the door. Wesley cooperated fully with the responding officers. He answered every question, provided every document, and stood in the lobby doing all of this while Tessa sat in the chair beside him and held her backpack in her lap and waited. The footage was posted before he left the building. By the time Wesley pulled out of the parking lot, the clip of Marissa tearing the check had been viewed over 40,000 times. By that evening, it was national. The detail that drove the reaction wasn't the check itself. It was the moment just before where Marissa could be seen looking at his jacket, and the moment just after where Tessa could be seen flinching at the sound of paper tearing. Those 2 seconds became the image attached to every headline. What came out over the following days made it worse. The bank's internal compliance team, prompted by Conrad's order to review Marissa's full case history, found a pattern that reached back further than 4 weeks. There had been other customers, a man in paint-stained work clothes who had been asked to provide identification 3 times for a transaction that required it once. An elderly woman whose withdrawal request had been flagged without cause and who had left without her money. A single mother who had come in with 2 young children and been told without explanation that her account would need to be reviewed before any transactions could proceed. Each of them had filed complaints. Each complaint had been categorized and closed without a follow-up call. The people who had closed those complaints were still employed at the bank. The machinery that had allowed Marissa to do what she did hadn't been built in 4 weeks. She had walked into a structure that was already comfortable with a certain kind of oversight, or the lack of it. That evening, Wesley made dinner at home, the same dinner he made most Thursdays. Pasta with the sauce Tessa liked, the one his wife had written down in a notebook he still kept in the cabinet above the stove. Tessa ate without talking much, which was unusual for her. She was a child who processed things by speaking them aloud, who narrated her way through problems until they became manageable. Her silence meant she was still somewhere inside it. When she finally spoke, she was looking at her plate, pushing pasta with her fork. And she asked the question, the way children ask the questions that matter, without preamble, without softening, without any apparent awareness that it was going to land like something thrown from a height. "If that man hadn't come in," she said, "if he didn't already know who you were, would they have apologized to you?" Wesley put his fork down. He thought about the lobby, as it had been before Conrad walked through the door. He thought about Curtis's hand on his shoulder, and the phones in the air, and the man who had said what he'd said about Tessa, and how no one had disagreed. He thought about the way the room had shifted, not when Wesley had provided his documents, not when Jenna had spoken up, not when he'd offered the number of his attorney, but in the specific moment when Conrad had used one word in front of witnesses. He didn't answer Tessa's question that night, and she didn't push. She helped him clear the table and went to do her homework, and the question stayed in the kitchen after she left, sitting in the space where an answer should have been. 3 days later, a lawyer representing Meridian Trust Bank called to request a meeting. They sent 2 people to his house, a senior counsel and a communications officer carrying a settlement proposal that was by any financial measure substantial. There was a personal payment, an offer to cover all legal fees, a public statement of apology, and a provision to establish a small fund in Tessa's name. There was also a clause that would require Wesley to sign a confidentiality agreement to discontinue any further inquiry into the bank's complaint history, and to make no public statements referencing cases other than his own. Wesley read through it carefully. He asked the 2 representatives to give him a day, and they agreed, and they left. He sat at the kitchen table after they were gone and thought about what the agreement would actually accomplish. Marissa was already terminated. The bank's public image had taken damage it was going to spend years repairing. The settlement was real money that would secure Tessa's future in ways the fund he'd planned could not. He had earned the right to take it. Nobody would argue otherwise. But the complaints that had been closed without follow-up would stay closed. The managers who had approved that practice would remain in their positions. The next person who walked into a Meridian Trust branch in paint-stained clothes, or with a child on their hip, would encounter the same structure Marissa had operated inside, because the settlement would seal off the part of the story that made that structure visible. Wesley thought about Tessa's question again. He thought about the answer he hadn't been able to give her. He thought about what it meant to win something that left everyone who came after you exactly as unprotected as you had been. He closed the folder. He called Conrad Ellis the next morning. Not the legal team, not a representative, not anyone whose job it was to manage the distance between two parties in a dispute. Conrad picked up on the second ring, which told Wesley that the call had been expected. Wesley told him he wasn't going to sign the agreement. Conrad said he'd assumed as much. Then Wesley told him what he wanted instead, and Conrad was quiet for long enough that Wesley could hear the city through the office window on the other end of the line. Wesley laid out 4 conditions. The first was structural. No single employee at any branch level would have the authority to freeze an account or make a fraud determination without sign-off from a second manager, and any customer who disputed that determination would have the right to an independent verification process, not a call to the same branch, not a form routed back to the person who made the original call, but a genuinely separate review. He was specific about what that meant, because he knew how institutions absorbed requirements they didn't want by satisfying the letter of them while gutting the function. The second condition was about the people who had already been failed. Every complaint that had been closed without a documented follow-up would be reopened and reviewed by an external firm, not an internal team. Any employee who had made the decision to close those complaints without investigation would face their own review. Wesley was not asking for mass terminations. He was asking for the decisions to be examined by people who had no interest in the outcome. The third condition was transparency. A full independent audit of discriminatory practices across all branches in the region, with findings made available to the public, not summarized in a press release, not softened into a diversity statement, but released in a form that could be read and evaluated by anyone who walked through those doors and wondered whether the institution treated people differently based on how they looked when they came in. The fourth condition was the one that had kept him up the previous night. He wanted Meridian Trust to commit to long-term funding for a single-parent support program, scholarships for children, child care assistance, financial education, emergency relief. Not as a one-time donation attached to a press event, but as a structured, annually audited commitment with independent oversight. If they pulled the funding in year 2 because the news cycle had moved on, the contract moved with it. Conrad told him the board would need to be involved. Wesley said he understood that, and that the board had 1 week. The meeting happened in 4 days. Wesley went alone without an attorney, which surprised the 8 people sitting on the other side of the table enough that 2 of them glanced at each other before anyone spoke. The board's lead counsel opened by acknowledging the seriousness of what had occurred and expressing the institution's regret. Wesley thanked him and asked when they wanted to begin discussing the conditions. One of the board members, a man named Richard Silverhaired, with the careful patience of someone who had spent decades turning confrontation into negotiation, leaned forward and said that Wesley was understandably upset that the bank took full responsibility for the conduct of its employee, and that the conditions he was proposing went significantly beyond what any reasonable person would expect as remedy for a personal incident. Wesley told him that the incident had lasted less than an hour. The conditions he was proposing addressed practices that the bank's own compliance records showed had been operating for years. If the board wanted to characterize it as a personal incident, they were welcome to that framing, but the audit findings were going to become public regardless of what Wesley did, because he had not been the one to initiate the compliance review. Conrad had. And those findings described an institution, not a person. Richard said the bank's concern was the scope of the intervention. Wesley asked him what scope he would consider appropriate for a system that had spent years quietly closing complaints from customers who didn't have the leverage to force them back open. Richard didn't answer that directly. He talked about regulatory frameworks, about existing oversight structures, about the bank's commitment to continuous improvement. Wesley told the room that he would tear up the $620 million contract and move every account managed by Carver Ridge Partners out of Meridian Trust by the end of the quarter if all 4 conditions were not accepted in writing. He said it the same way he'd said everything else that week, without theater, without visible anger, which made it land harder than anger would have. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the board's chairman, a woman named Patricia, who had not spoken yet, asked Wesley a single question: whether he was prepared to walk away from the contract entirely if they modified but did not fully accept his terms. Wesley said yes. Patricia looked at the other board members, and the meeting moved into its next phase. They accepted all 4 conditions. The written agreement was signed 6 days later. What followed in the weeks after was neither dramatic nor neat, which is how real accountability usually works. Marissa Keene's termination was already final, but the investigation her actions had triggered moved through the institution slowly and without headlines. Her licensing was placed under review by the State Financial Regulatory Authority, which meant she couldn't step into a comparable role anywhere in the industry while the review was active. The managers who had approved the practice of closing unresolved complaints were placed on administrative leave. 2 of them resigned before the process concluded. Curtis Lane's situation was handled separately from everything else. The camera footage had made clear that he'd used no force and had visibly hesitated at multiple points. He was suspended for 2 weeks while the bank's HR process ran its course, then reinstated with a requirement to complete a new training program on employee rights and lawful order compliance. Several weeks after his reinstatement, before the 3-month mark, while things were still being restructured at the branch, Wesley came in for a follow-up meeting with Conrad. Curtis was at his post near the entrance. He walked over before Wesley reached the door and said that he knew he had done the wrong thing and that he was sorry. He said it plainly without excuses attached. Wesley told him that he appreciated that, and that knowing the right thing and doing it when it cost something were 2 different skills, but that it was possible to build the second one, and he hoped Curtis would. Curtis nodded, and that was the end of it. Jenna Boyd was promoted to assistant branch manager not long after. She was also given responsibility for rolling out the bank's new whistleblower protection program across all branches in the region. A program that, because of the conditions Wesley had negotiated, had actual structural protections rather than a hotline number posted in a break room. She didn't take any public credit for what she had done on the day of the incident. She didn't need to. Everyone in the branch knew. More than that, everyone knew what would have happened without her. The $5 million check was formally voided and a replacement issued. Wesley deposited it and used it exactly as he had planned, $2.5 million into the Educational Trust for Tessa and $2.5 million to establish the Carver Single Parent Opportunity Fund, which provided scholarships for children of single-parent households, child care cost assistance, emergency financial relief, and free financial literacy courses. He worked with a small nonprofit administrator to structure it so the fund would continue operating independently of any decisions he made about his business relationships. He also made one specific request: the first awards from the fund were to be presented at the Brookhaven branch of Meridian Trust Bank. The same branch, the same address. 3 months after the morning Wesley had pulled into that parking lot, thinking about dinner and a bookstore, he and Tessa pulled into the same lot in the same car. He reached for the same jacket. He always reached for the old canvas one his wife had given him the winter before she got sick. It was worn at the elbows and faded at the collar, and he had never once considered replacing it. Tessa noticed it when he put it on, and she didn't say anything about it, and that was its own kind of acknowledgement. The branch looked the same from outside. Inside, the differences were smaller than Wesley had expected, which reassured him more than a dramatic renovation would have. There was a laminated notice near the entrance listing customer rights in plain language: the right to request a second review, the right to an independent verification process, a phone number for a compliance office that was independent of the branch. It wasn't prominent, but it was there and it was specific, and that specificity was what mattered. Vague commitments disappeared. Specific ones could be pointed to. Jenna met them at the door. She shook Wesley's hand and crouched down slightly to greet Tessa, who had met her once before briefly in the aftermath of a day that had not been a good one for anyone. The exchange between them this time was different, easier, more grounded. Tessa asked Jenna if she liked her new job. Jenna said that she did, that it was harder than her old one, and that harder was usually a sign you were doing something worth doing. Tessa thought about that and said it sounded right. Curtis was near the door, as he always was. When Wesley came in, Curtis caught his eye and gave a small nod. Not the nod of someone seeking approval, but the nod of someone who had decided to show up differently and wanted to mark that without making it into a production. Wesley nodded back, and that was enough. They moved toward the back of the branch, where the fund's first awards were being presented. No podium, no press, no professionally designed banner. Just a table, some chairs, a few families who had been informed by letter, and the ordinary light of a weekday morning coming through the same windows Wesley had been walked toward 3 months ago. Tessa stood beside him and watched the room. She watched a woman in her early 30s sign paperwork for a scholarship that would cover the first 2 years of her daughter's college tuition. She watched a man who looked like he hadn't slept in several days receive an emergency relief approval that would let him make rent while he searched for work after a layoff. Then something near the teller windows caught her attention, not arranged, not timed, just happening the way ordinary things happen in a place that has remembered what it's supposed to be. A young father was at one of the stations, maybe 25, in a work uniform, with a company logo across the chest, the kind of uniform that picks up the day's worth of activity on its sleeves and collar. He was opening a savings account for his son, a boy of about 4, who stood beside him with one hand in his father's and the other holding a small toy. The teller working with them was taking her time explaining each step, not glancing at the uniform or the toy or anything other than the paperwork in front of her. She asked the father what name he wanted on the account. He spelled his son's name carefully, and she typed it carefully, and it took as long as it needed to take. Tessa watched this without saying anything. Then she looked up at Wesley and asked if that was why he hadn't just walked away from the bank after everything that happened, if that was the reason he'd pushed for all of it, instead of taking the settlement and leaving. Wesley looked at the young father at the window at the teller, giving him her full attention, at the small boy with his toy, standing on linoleum, that didn't care what was on his father's uniform. He told Tessa that leaving a place because it was unfair was easy. Almost anyone could do that. What was harder and what actually changed anything was forcing the place to become fair for the person who walked in after you. Especially for the person who didn't have a $620 million contract to put on the table when they needed someone to take them seriously. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted to be the one to hand over the first scholarship letter. Wesley had planned to do it himself, but he looked at her and said, "Of course." She carried the envelope to a 16-year-old girl who was sitting with her father near the edge of the room. Her father, who had raised her alone, who had brought her here in his own work clothes, who had no idea when he woke up that morning that the day was going to hold something like this. Tessa held out the envelope with both hands and told the girl that the award was from a fund started by her dad and that she hoped it helped. The girl's father looked at Wesley across the room and did something that wasn't quite a nod and wasn't quite a bow, just a tilt of the head, small and genuine, that carried more weight than most formal expressions of gratitude Wesley had ever received. After it was over, Wesley and Tessa walked back to the car. The parking lot was the same parking lot. The car was the same car. He held the door for her the way he always had, and she climbed in and balanced her backpack on her knees the way she always did, and he started the engine. She asked if they were still going to the bookstore. He said yes. And then dinner. She said okay, and looked out the window at the bank as they pulled out of the lot, not with anger, not with triumph, just with the careful assessing look of a 9-year-old who had seen something true about the world and was still working out what to do with it. The jacket on Wesley's back was worn and faded. The car beneath them had seen better years. Nothing about him looked like $5 million. Nothing about him ever had. And from that morning forward, anyone who walked through that door in paint-stained work clothes or a decade-old jacket or a uniform with someone else's logo on the chest would be treated as though their dignity didn't require a balance sheet to justify it. That was the thing Marissa Keene had never understood, and the thing Tessa Carver was beginning to. It had never been about the check. Wesley didn't change who he was to prove something to a room full of strangers. He just waited for the truth to catch up. And when it did, he used every bit of power he had, not to get even, but to make sure the next person walking through that door wouldn't need a $620 million contract to be treated like a human being. That's worth thinking about. Not just for the people who hold the power, but for the rest of us who are in that lobby every single day, phones in hand, deciding whether to say something or stay quiet. If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're not subscribed yet, join us every week. We bring you stories about the moments that reveal who people really are when the stakes are high and the room is watching. We'll see you in the next one.